The White House briefing room buzzed with anticipation. Journalists jostled for position, cameras adjusted their lenses, and the air crackled with the familiar tension that accompanied every press conference under President Donald Trump's administration. It had been a particularly fiery week in Washington, and today, Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt was about to step into the lion's den once again. As the doors swung open, Karoline strode to the podium with the confident grace that had made her a favorite among conservative circles. At just 27 years old, she had taken the role of White House press secretary by storm, handling the media with a mix of charm, wit, and unapologetic bluntness. Today, however, was going to be different. Today, she wasn't just facing the usual press corps. She was about to go head-to-head with one of the most outspoken liberal talk show hosts in America. Enter Jordan Myles. A darling of the progressive movement, Myles was the host of the American Pulse, a nightly political talk show known for its relentless criticism of the Trump administration. With his thick-rimmed glasses, perpetually unbuttoned blazer, and an air of smug superiority, Myles had made a name for himself by grilling conservative guests until they either snapped or walked off his set. But today, rather than hiding behind the comfort of his studio, he had taken a seat in the front row of the press briefing room, armed with a microphone, an agenda, and an ego the size of a CNN ratings crisis. Karoline adjusted the microphone, gave the room a confident smile, and spoke. "Good afternoon, everyone. I know we're all eager to jump into today's topics, but before we get to the usual suspects, I'd like to extend a special welcome to the American Pulse's very own Jordan Myles. Jordan, I have to say, it's a nice change seeing you without the dramatic background music and out-of-context video clips." A few chuckles rippled through the room, mostly from the conservative-leaning reporters who had grown tired of Myles' antics. Jordan, however, smirked, unfazed. "Happy to be here, Karoline," he said smoothly. "I figured since the White House is so allergic to tough questions, I'd bring a few myself." "Oh, Jordan," Karoline sighed playfully. "Bless your heart. If that were true, you'd be banned faster than The View lost its last conservative host." The room erupted in laughter. Even a few of the more neutral journalists couldn't help but chuckle at the quick-witted response. But Myles wasn't here for laughs, he was here for a fight. He leaned forward, gripping his microphone like a knight readying his sword. "Well then," he said, regaining his composure, "let's start with an easy one. How does this administration justify its blatant attacks on democracy? From voter suppression to threats against the free press, it seems President Trump is less interested in leading and more interested in running an authoritarian regime." A collective hush fell over the room. The battle had begun. Karoline tilted her head, pretending to be deep in thought. "Wow, Jordan, that's a big one. It's almost like you spent the last 24 hours in a focus group workshop to make sure you got all the right buzzwords in there. Let's break it down, shall we?" She took a sip of water as if to build the suspense. "First of all, if President Trump were running an authoritarian regime, I highly doubt you'd be sitting here asking that question on live television. In actual authoritarian regimes, like, say, China, which your beloved American Pulse seems to ignore, journalists don't get the privilege of pretending to be brave while sipping on their oat milk lattes." The room burst into laughter and gasps. Jordan shifted in his seat, visibly annoyed, but Karoline wasn't finished. "As for attacks on democracy, let me remind you that under this administration we've made it easier for Americans to vote, unless of course you mean things like voter ID laws, which even the majority of Democrats support according to polls. But I get it, Jordan. It must be exhausting having to pretend every common-sense policy is an attack on democracy. I hope you get hazard pay for that." Another wave of chuckles rippled through the room, and even some of the seasoned journalists nodded in agreement. Jordan, however, had come prepared. "I notice you didn't deny the threats against the free press," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe because this administration has repeatedly called journalists the enemy of the people?" Karoline exhaled sharply, shaking her head with a knowing smile. "Ah, the classic enemy of the people argument. Jordan, let me ask you something. When President Trump calls out the mainstream media for their blatant bias, do you honestly believe he's talking about every single journalist in America? Or is he referring to, say, certain networks that push Russia collusion hoaxes for 3 years, conveniently forget about it, then move on to the next fabricated scandal like a goldfish with a Twitter account? Jordan opened his mouth, but Karoline raised a finger. And before you answer, let's not pretend like your show doesn't run segments calling conservatives everything from racists to white supremacists. You're more than happy to sling those labels around. But when someone calls you out for actual dishonest reporting, suddenly it's an attack on democracy. Jordan's smirk wavered. He was losing control of the narrative. Look, Karoline continued, if you want to be a journalist, be a journalist. Ask tough questions, report the truth, and stop acting like being fact-checked is the same as being oppressed. Because I promise you, Jordan, your biggest hardship isn't government persecution. It's your show's dismal ratings. Boom. The room erupted. Even some of the White House correspondents who typically opposed Karoline had to stifle their laughter. Jordan, red-faced and fuming, gripped his microphone tighter. And just like that, the gloves were off. The room was electric. A few reporters exchanged glances, some clearly amused, others eager to see how this clash between Karoline Leavitt and Jordan Myles would unfold. Jordan, though momentarily thrown off balance by Karoline's razor-sharp comeback, quickly recovered. This wasn't his first time in the hot seat, and he wasn't about to let a press secretary, no matter how skilled, humiliate him on live television. Adjusting his glasses, he leaned forward. All right, Karoline, he said, his voice dripping with faux patience. Let's talk about honesty and bias, since you're so keen on the subject. Just last week, President Trump made a claim, completely unsupported by evidence, that mass voter fraud cost Republicans key seats in the 2024 elections. Does the administration stand by that? Or are we finally admitting that was just another baseless conspiracy theory? Karoline smiled. A smile that was equal parts amusement and predatory confidence. Ah, Jordan, she said, clasping her hands on the podium. I see what you did there. You took a legitimate concern that millions of Americans have about election integrity and framed it as a conspiracy theory. Classic. I swear, if I had $1 for every time a liberal journalist used that phrase, I could probably fund CNN's entire payroll. Laughter rippled through the room, and even some of the less partisan reporters grinned at the jab. Jordan, however, wasn't amused. Karoline continued. Now let's address the real issue here. Election security is a legitimate concern, and ensuring fair elections should be a bipartisan goal. But let's be honest, Jordan, your network only calls something a threat to democracy when Republicans say it. When Democrats question election results, like Hillary Clinton in 2016 or Stacey Abrams in 2018, your show treats them like heroes. Why the double standard? Jordan opened his mouth, but Karoline wasn't done. Oh, and before you say, but those situations were different, let's recall that Democrats spent years claiming Trump was an illegitimate president because of Russian interference, a claim that turned out to be as real as Elizabeth Warren's Cherokee ancestry. The room exploded in laughter. Some of the younger conservative reporters were visibly struggling to keep their composure, while others in the press pool exchanged amused whispers. Even a couple of the liberal-leaning journalists shook their heads, knowing full well how flimsy the Russian collusion narrative had become. Jordan, now visibly irritated, leaned back in his chair, gripping his microphone. So, just to be clear, he said, trying to keep his voice steady, you're saying that Trump's claims of voter fraud have actual evidence? Karoline tilted her head, feigning curiosity. Jordan, tell me something. Have you actually read any of the lawsuits, affidavits, or election audits that Republican officials, many of whom are career election workers, not politicians, have presented? Jordan shifted uncomfortably. That's not the point. Oh, it absolutely is, Karoline interrupted. You call it a conspiracy because it's politically convenient, not because you've actually examined the facts. That's the problem with liberal media. You don't investigate, you narrate. The tension in the room thickened. Jordan clenched his jaw, clearly frustrated, but Karoline wasn't about to let up. But hey, she added with a playful shrug, if you ever decide to do actual journalism instead of running PR for the DNC, I hear Newsmax is hiring. Another round of laughter erupted. Jordan looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. He quickly flipped through his notes, trying to pivot. Fine, he said. Let's move on to foreign policy. President Trump recently called NATO allies deadbeats and suggested that countries not paying their fair share shouldn't expect American protection. Does this administration really believe in abandoning our allies? Karoline raised an eyebrow. Jordan, are you really asking me if the president believes that countries should pay what they agreed to pay before expecting American military protection? Because if you're shocked by that idea, I'd hate to see your reaction when your own landlord asks for rent. More laughter. Jordan Myles was clearly losing control of the conversation. Karoline continued, leaning in slightly. Look, the president isn't abandoning our allies. He's asking them to act like responsible partners. It's funny how the left suddenly cares about NATO when just a few years ago, their golden boy Barack Obama was pulling out of Middle Eastern commitments left and right. Jordan's mouth tightened. So you're saying Trump is helping NATO? I'm saying Trump is treating NATO like a grown-up relationship, not a one-sided charity program, Karoline shot back. But I get it, Jordan. Liberals prefer relationships where one side does all the work while the other makes empty promises. Kind of like your show's attempt at journalism. The room exploded again. Even some of the White House correspondents who were known critics of the administration were chuckling. Jordan, however, was fuming. Before he could launch into another question, Karoline looked at him and smiled sweetly. Jordan, I have to hand it to you. Most people can't handle getting wrecked on live TV. But you just keep coming back for more. It's almost inspiring. Jordan's lips parted, but no words came out. He was at a complete loss. Karoline turned back to the rest of the press room. All right, who's got an actual question? The conservative reporters laughed. Jordan Myles had come to the White House to take down the Trump administration. Instead, he had been roasted beyond recognition. And Karoline Leavitt? She was just getting started. The briefing room was still buzzing from Karoline Leavitt's last zinger. Jordan Myles, visibly flustered, had retreated into silence for a brief moment, a rarity for someone who made a living talking over conservative guests on his show. But he wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his blazer and adjusted his glasses. All right, Karoline, he said, forcing a smirk. You've had your fun. But let's talk about something that actually matters to the American people. This administration is constantly talking about America first. But what about the humanitarian crisis at the border? Children are being detained in facilities that your party once called concentration camps under Biden. How do you justify that? A murmur rippled through the press corps. It was a loaded question designed to put Karoline on the defensive. But if there was one thing she excelled at, it was flipping the script. Karoline tilted her head, pretending to think. You know, Jordan, it's fascinating that you suddenly care about border policies now that Trump is in office again. Because the last time I checked, under Biden, we had record illegal crossings, skyrocketing fentanyl deaths, and actual child trafficking rings exploiting the broken system. And yet, you and your friends in the media were quieter than Kamala Harris at a policy meeting. Laughter erupted in the room. Even some of the liberal-leaning reporters couldn't hide their amusement. Jordan's face tightened. That's not an answer. Are you saying Trump's policies are better than Biden's? Karoline raised an eyebrow. Jordan, I don't need to say it. The numbers do. Illegal crossings are down under President Trump's return to strong border policies. You know what that means? Fewer kids being trafficked, fewer drugs pouring into American communities, and fewer criminals abusing the system. So unless you want more chaos at the border, I'd love to hear your alternative solution. Or do you just prefer shouting concentration camps without offering actual fixes? Jordan opened his mouth, then closed it. He had spent the last 4 years attacking Trump's policies without ever being asked for a real alternative. Karoline smirked. That's what I thought. The conservative reporters chuckled while Jordan fumbled with his notes. But Karoline wasn't done. And speaking of hypocrisy, Jordan, let's talk about the liberal elite's favorite game. Rules for thee, but not for me. Democrats love open borders until illegal immigrants show up in their backyard. I mean, just look at what happened when Republican governors sent migrants to sanctuary cities like New York and Chicago. Suddenly, those welcoming liberals were begging the federal government to make them stop. It's almost like they don't want to deal with the consequences of their own policies. More laughter. Jordan clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling over. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I came here for a serious discussion, not a comedy routine." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I'm sorry, Jordan. I thought you were serious. You and your network spent years pushing absurd narratives. And now that someone's pushing back, it's suddenly unfair." She shook her head with mock sympathy. "Life's tough when you're not the one controlling the edit button." "Huh?" The reporters erupted again. Jordan Myles looked like he was ready to flip his chair. Karoline leaned in slightly, her voice calm but firm. "You see, Jordan, the problem isn't that I'm making jokes. The problem is that you and your liberal friends are used to controlling the conversation. You're used to spinning narratives unchecked, labeling everyone who disagrees with you as a racist, a fascist, or an extremist. But today, you're facing pushback. And I get it, it's uncomfortable. But welcome to reality." Jordan exhaled sharply, looking at his notes as if searching for an escape. But Karoline wasn't going to let him off the hook just yet. "You came here thinking you were going to expose this administration," she continued. "But all you've done is expose your own bias. So, tell me, Jordan, do you have any actual questions? Or are we just going to keep playing gotcha politics with Myles until your producers pull the plug?" The room burst into laughter again. Jordan Myles, for the first time in his career, was speechless. And Karoline Leavitt? She was just getting warmed up. Jordan Myles shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face, once smug with confidence, now twitched with frustration. He had come to the White House briefing room expecting to dismantle the Trump administration's talking points. Instead, he was the one being taken apart piece by Karoline Leavitt. But he wasn't about to go down without a fight. Clearing his throat, he gripped his microphone and forced a smirk. "All right, Karoline, since you love flipping the narrative, let's try something simple. The president recently called climate activists idiots and dismissed concerns about global warming as overhyped nonsense. Does the administration really believe that climate change isn't a crisis?" Karoline leaned forward, a playful glint in her eye. "Jordan, first of all, let's clear something up. President Trump isn't dismissing climate concerns. He's dismissing the hypocrisy of the climate cult." The room went silent, save for a few amused chuckles from conservative reporters. Jordan frowned. "Climate cult?" Karoline nodded. "Oh, absolutely. You know, the people who demand Americans give up their gas stoves while they fly private jets to climate summits? The ones who tell working-class families to buy $60,000 electric cars while they get chauffeured around in gas-guzzling SUVs? Those guys." More laughter. Jordan rolled his eyes. "So you're denying the science?" Karoline smirked. "Oh no, Jordan. I'm denying your side's selective outrage. Tell me, if climate change is such an emergency, why did John Kerry's private jet burn more fuel in a year than an entire neighborhood of middle-class Americans? Why do Hollywood elites preach about carbon footprints while living in mansions that require more electricity than a small town?" Jordan's mouth twitched. "That's not." No, let's be fair," Karoline interrupted, holding up a hand. "I love the way liberal elites handle climate change. The planet is dying. So let's raise taxes and make you pay for it. I mean, genius strategy, Jordan. Really." The laughter in the room was deafening. Even some of the liberal-leaning reporters were biting their lips to keep from chuckling. Jordan's patience was wearing thin. "So just to be clear," he said, his voice tight, "the Trump administration doesn't believe climate change is an existential threat?" Karoline sighed dramatically. "Jordan, if the world was ending in 10 years, do you really think Obama would have bought a $12 million mansion on the ocean? Come on." The room erupted again. Jordan looked like he wanted to disappear, but Karoline wasn't finished. "You see, this is the problem, Jordan," she continued, clasping her hands together. "Your side doesn't want an honest debate. You want a panic button, something to scare people into giving the government more power. And let's be real, it's not about saving the planet. If it were, You'd be holding China accountable for pollution instead of asking truckers in Ohio to pay carbon taxes. Jordan Myles was visibly fuming. His smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by a forced smile that barely hid his frustration. He had walked into this briefing with a plan to expose the Trump administration, to paint Karoline Leavitt as incompetent, and to secure viral soundbites that would play well with his network's audience. Instead, he had become the soundbite. Karoline watched him struggle with his notes, her expression unreadable but clearly amused. She had more to say, but she knew it was only a matter of time before Jordan self-destructed. And then it happened. Jordan, desperate to reclaim control, leaned forward aggressively. All right, Karoline, enough deflections. Let's talk about democracy. Your boss, Donald Trump, has called the media the enemy of the people. He has suggested that journalists like me are spreading lies and propaganda. Do you stand by those claims? Do you believe that the free press is the enemy of America? A murmur rippled through the room. This was his moment, his last-ditch effort to corner her. If Karoline said yes, he could paint her as an authoritarian mouthpiece. If she said no, he could accuse her of contradicting Trump. But Karoline had been in the game long enough to see the trap coming from a mile away. She smiled. Jordan, the media isn't the enemy of the people. You are. Gasps, murmurs, and then silence. Jordan's face turned red. Excuse me? Karoline kept her gaze locked on him, her voice calm and unwavering. You want to talk about democracy? Let's talk about what you and your network have done to it. You spent years pushing the Russia collusion hoax, claiming Trump stole the 2016 election with zero evidence. Then, when the actual evidence of election interference came out, you ignored it. You called Hunter Biden's laptop Russian disinformation when it was real, all because it helped your preferred candidate. And let's not forget your network's obsession with silencing conservative voices, canceling people who disagree with the left, and labeling half the country as extremists simply because they dared to vote for Donald Trump. Jordan blinked rapidly, caught between anger and panic. Karoline leaned in slightly, her voice sharpening. The media was supposed to hold the powerful accountable. Instead, people like you became their attack dogs. You don't report the news, you shape it. You decide what's truth, based on what helps your party. That's not journalism, Jordan. That's propaganda. The room was dead silent. Even the liberal reporters who had once laughed at Jordan's jabs were now shifting in their seats, uncomfortable with how brutally he was being exposed. Jordan stammered. H, that's not fair. My network. Karoline held up a hand. Oh, don't worry, Jordan. You're not alone. It's the entire mainstream media. You gaslight the American people, tell them they didn't see what they just saw, and then act outraged when they stop trusting you. That's why Trump called you the enemy of the people. Because you don't inform, you manipulate. Jordan Myles was speechless. Karoline let the silence hang for a moment, then casually flipped open her briefing folder. Next question. The room burst into whispers. Cameras zoomed in on Jordan's defeated expression. Conservative media was already tweeting out clips. And Jordan? He looked like he wanted to disappear. Jordan Myles sat frozen, his face a mix of humiliation and fury. The cameras had caught every second of his public takedown, and there was no escaping the fallout. Back in the control room of his network, producers were scrambling. Cut the feed. Cut the... No, we can't. It's live across all major outlets. If we pull it, they'll just accuse us of censoring it. The network executives watching from their high-rise offices weren't just sweating. They were in full-blown panic mode. This wasn't just a bad segment. This was a disaster. Jordan had walked into the White House thinking he'd make headlines exposing Trump's administration. Instead, he had become the headline. And Karoline Leavitt? She was thriving. She casually turned to the next reporter in the room, as if she hadn't just annihilated one of the biggest names in left-wing media. Yes, Jake? She said, nodding at another journalist. Jake, a more moderate journalist from an independent news outlet, hesitated before clearing his throat. Miss Leavitt, let's shift gears a bit. The economy. But Jordan Myles wasn't done yet. Still reeling from the humiliation, he slammed his hand down on the table. No, 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 no. I'm not letting you get away with this. He spat, his voice shaking. You just accused the free press of manipulating the truth, of being propagandists. That's dangerous rhetoric, Karoline. It's the kind of language that gets reporters threatened. Karoline sighed dramatically. Oh, here we go. The victim card. The room chuckled again. Jordan's face twisted in frustration. It's not a joke, he snapped. Words have consequences. Do you deny that Trump's rhetoric about the media has made it harder for journalists to do their jobs? Karoline smirked. Oh, Jordan, I'd love to feel bad for you, I really would. But you and your network spent years telling Americans that they were racist, sexist, and extremists just because they supported Trump. You called parents domestic terrorists for speaking up at school board meetings. You pushed actual misinformation about COVID, about the border, about everything. And now you want to cry about consequences. Jordan gritted his teeth. That's not. No, Jordan. Actions have consequences. Lies have consequences. Karoline cut in, her voice firm. The only reason Americans don't trust the media anymore is because of what you did. Not Trump. Not me. You. The press corps was silent again. Jordan had nothing left to say. At that moment, his earpiece buzzed. Jordan. Wrap it up. Now. His producers had seen enough. This wasn't a salvageable moment, it was a train wreck. Jordan clenched his jaw, gripping his notes so tightly his knuckles went white. Fine, he muttered. I'm done here. He yanked off his microphone, shoved his chair back, and stormed out of the briefing room. Cameras followed him as he pushed through the door, ignoring the reporters whispering behind their hands. And Karoline? She simply smiled, folded her hands on the podium, and said, Next question. The moment Jordan Myles stormed out of the White House press briefing room, the internet erupted. Within minutes, clips of Karoline Leavitt's takedown were flooding social media. Hashtag Karoline Roasts Jordan began trending on X, formerly Twitter, at lightning speed. Conservative commentators, meme pages, and everyday Americans were sharing the footage with captions like, She just ended his whole career. Jordan Myles thought he had her cornered. Turns out, she was holding the flamethrower. Journalist? More like amateur debate club dropout. Over on YouTube, right-wing channels were already uploading reaction videos. Thumbnails showed Jordan Myles mid-stammer, with bold captions like, Karoline destroys MSM hypocrisy, and Press Secretary claps back hard. Meanwhile, liberal networks were in damage control mode. Jordan's network quickly released a statement claiming that Karoline had used inflammatory rhetoric against a journalist and fanned the flames of division. But the damage was already done. On X, Elon Musk himself had chimed in, Wow, this was brutal. Truth bombs everywhere. The White House's official account responded with a simple gif of Trump smirking. Even some moderate journalists were begrudgingly acknowledging Karoline's victory. CNN's Jake Tapper hesitantly tweeted, Not a great look for Jordan Myles. He walked into that one. The meme machine was working overtime. One of the most viral posts, a screenshot of Karoline's smirk, with the caption, Press F for Jordan. By the end of the night, Karoline Leavitt had gone from a rising star to a full-blown conservative icon. And Jordan Myles? He had just become the biggest meme on the internet. Back at his network's headquarters, Jordan Myles stormed into the newsroom, his face still red with anger. Producers, interns, and fellow reporters avoided eye contact as he marched toward the executive offices. He slammed the door open without knocking. This is a disaster, he snapped at the senior producers gathered inside. Do you see what's happening? They're laughing at me. At us. The lead producer, a middle-aged woman named Diane Grayson, sighed and pinched the bridge of her nose. We know, Jordan. We're handling it. Handling it? Handling it? Jordan practically shouted. Twitter is eating me alive. The clips have millions of views. Even Tapper threw me under the bus. Do you know how bad this looks? Diane leaned forward. We're spinning it, she said calmly. We've already lined up panelists to say Karoline's attacks were dangerous and undermining democracy. We're framing it as a coordinated effort to delegitimize the press. Jordan clenched his fists. That's not going to work. Did you even see the actual clip? She didn't just make me look bad. She exposed us. Diane narrowed her eyes. Watch your tone, Jordan. Another producer, a younger man named Mark, spoke up hesitantly. Look, we all saw what happened. Karoline was sharp, quick-witted. And honestly, we walked into it. Jordan shot him a glare. Excuse me? Mark shrugged. We expected her to be an easy target. We underestimated her. She didn't just defend Trump. She flipped the script. And the audience ate it up. Diane sighed again. Jordan, we need to get ahead of this. We can't let them control the narrative. Jordan scoffed. What narrative? I got humiliated. Diane tapped her pen on the table. Which is why we're pivoting. We're going to focus on the bigger picture. Trump's rhetoric, the so-called war on journalism, the dangerous precedent Karoline is setting. Jordan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It won't work. People saw it with their own eyes. The audience isn't stupid. Diane raised an eyebrow. Aren't they? The room went silent. After a pause, Diane continued. We control the cycle. By tomorrow, this isn't going to be about you. It'll be about the threat that Karoline represents. We'll bring on experts to analyze her words. We'll push the idea that she's a symbol of rising authoritarianism. We'll dig up old tweets, comments, anything we can use to paint her as a danger to democracy. Jordan swallowed hard. And if that doesn't work? Diane leaned back, a smirk forming. Then we go after her personally. Jordan hesitated. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. But after the public humiliation he had just endured, he wasn't in a position to argue. Fine, he muttered. Let's do it. By the next morning, Jordan Myles' network was in full-blown damage control mode. The new strategy was simple. Shift the focus away from his humiliation and turn Karoline Leavitt into the villain. Headlines on their website and other left-leaning outlets were already running with the narrative. Trump's press secretary's dangerous rhetoric against journalists. The chilling effect of Karoline Leavitt's attack on the free press. Is Karoline Leavitt the new face of right-wing extremism? On their morning talk shows, well-rehearsed pundits were already seated, ready to play their part. A stern-faced analyst from a media watchdog group sighed dramatically. Look, we all saw what happened yesterday. This was not just a press briefing. This was an assault on journalism itself. The host nodded solemnly. She called Jordan Myles, an award-winning journalist, the enemy of the people. That's dangerous. A liberal professor from a prestigious university chimed in. Absolutely. This is classic authoritarianism, discrediting the press so that no one believes anything but state propaganda. The network was doing everything it could to paint Karoline as a threat to democracy. But the problem? No one was buying it. The internet was still ablaze with clips of Karoline's takedown. Conservative commentators, independent journalists, and even some moderates were ridiculing the very idea that Karoline had done anything other than defend herself. On X, even some left-leaning users were questioning the network's response. One post went viral. Wait, so we're supposed to believe that the press can attack conservatives daily? But when one conservative fights back, it's an attack on democracy? Give me a break. Another user replied, Jordan Myles got owned. Just take the L and move on. Meanwhile, on conservative news outlets, Karoline was being hailed as a rock star. She was booked for multiple interviews, appearing on Fox News, Newsmax, and the Daily Wire's flagship show. In her first post-briefing interview, Tucker Carlson grinned at her. Karoline, you didn't just win that debate. You obliterated them. She smiled. I was just doing my job, Tucker. The press comes in expecting to control the narrative, but not on my watch. His grin widened. You know they're smearing you now, right? They're calling you dangerous and authoritarian for pushing back against them. Karoline chuckled. Oh, of course. That's how they operate. When they can't win the argument, they attack the person. Tucker leaned in. So, how does it feel to be the most talked about press secretary in America right now? Karoline smirked. Feels like I'm just getting started. The segment went viral within minutes. Karoline was no longer just a press secretary. She was a cultural force. Back at Jordan Myles' network, executives were watching in horror. Their smear campaign? Backfiring spectacularly. And the worst part? Karoline wasn't afraid of them. By the end of the week, Karoline Leavitt wasn't just a household name. She was a conservative superstar. Her press conference takedown of Jordan Myles had become a defining moment in the culture war. Meme pages flooded the internet with her most savage lines, and late-night conservative talk shows couldn't get enough of the clip. Even mainstream comedians, who usually steered clear of praising anyone associated with Trump, were taking jabs at Jordan Myles for his embarrassing exit. Meanwhile, Jordan was spiraling. The smear campaign against Karoline had failed spectacularly. The American public wasn't buying the narrative that she was a dangerous extremist. If anything, their attempt to discredit her had made her more popular. Jordan's network was feeling the pressure. Ratings for his show had plummeted since the press conference. Calls for him to be benched were growing louder, even from within his own newsroom. And then the final blow came. At the next White House press briefing, Jordan Myles did not show up. Instead, a younger, lesser-known reporter from his network was sitting in his usual seat. Karoline took the podium, smiling as she scanned the room. "Oh, no Jordan today?" she asked playfully. A few reporters chuckled. Karoline smirked. "I was looking forward to round 2. The room erupted in laughter. Even some left-leaning journalists couldn't hide their smiles. Jordan Myles, the once powerful liberal media darling, had been officially dethroned. Aftermath. Karoline Leavitt's popularity soared, and she became a major figure in the conservative movement. Some even speculated that she had a bright future in politics beyond the press room. Jordan Myles took an extended leave of absence from his network. Though insiders knew it was code for being pushed out, the network attempted to move on from the fiasco, but their credibility had taken a massive hit. Donald Trump, never one to miss a moment, posted on Truth Social, "Karoline Leavitt, best press secretary ever, destroyed fake news Jordan Myles in front of the entire world. Mega!" As for Karoline, she walked out of the press briefing that day victorious.